I wanted to take 5 weeks, beginning this Sunday and until the first Sunday of July, and think about gospel principles for God's people, so that we can be the kind of people that, as we have opportunity again to gather together, that it would be a uniting experience, an experience of love, an experience of sacrifice and of humility and of submission. And to that end, I want us to look at Romans 12 through 14, not necessarily verse by verse, but with some of the big themes. And so this morning, I wanted to just start by looking at Romans chapter 12, and look at just the very first verse of this chapter. Paul writes, and he says, "I appeal to you, brothers, therefore, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship." If there was ever a time where things were polarizing, it's today. We have questions of how do we protect people's health versus how do we maintain a healthy economy. We have tensions about how do we maintain social distancing and yet uphold the rights and privileges of every person made in the image of God and have protests. Are we compromising if we don't go to a rally versus are we compromising if we do go to a rally? Are we putting people's health at stake if we don't defend the cause of racial justice? And do we compromise people's health if we gather in large groups during a pandemic? We have all sorts of issues that now face us that just continue to compound. We hear news of and discussions about defunding police forces. Do you support the defunding of police programs or not? Do you support Black Lives Matter or not? Are you the kind of person who is pro-protest or pro-social distancing to reduce the effects of a pandemic? Are you a person who goes into a grocery store and who looks upon others wondering why they don't wear a mask? Or are you the kind of person who goes into the grocery store and wonders, why are all these people making a big deal and wearing a mask? We're looking at situations where we wonder about large, massive gatherings that are protesting the evil that has been done in the death of George Floyd, and we wonder how can we stop a world of injustice where racial injustice pervades the systems even of our country. How do we live in a country where we can gather together in large groups to protest, but houses of worship remain closed? And we can have all sorts of these tensions that go on. And these are times that I am concerned could become the most polarizing, the most pulling apart of times because of how many issues are facing us in this day. And into this situation, we hear the letter that Paul writes to the Romans. And Paul writes this letter, and it is a timely letter for us and for our day to give us gospel principles as the people of God so that we might live in this world with all of the chaos and all of the disruption going on and not be pulled apart, but rather be drawn together. Why is Romans a good letter? Specifically, why these chapters? Well, Paul wrote specifically to a congregation that faced the polarizing issues of race, Jew versus Gentile, those who knew the privileges of being a religious people and those who had been secular. He was writing to people who had strong consciences about how they practiced their religious convictions and those who had more libertarian consciences. And because of that, it was a congregation that faced polarizing positions. In the midst of that, this was a congregation in Rome that certainly had to deal with the effects of a government that was not supportive of Christians gathering. And so, here we come to Romans 12 through 14 specifically. And in a time where, just like the church in Rome could have been threatened by racial prejudice or injustice, by a government that was oppressive and difficult, by polarizing opinions about how to handle certain practices. We too are in that same kind of moment. And because we're in that kind of moment, Romans is for these times. Romans is intended to pull us together, not to have us pulled apart. And because of that, this sermon series, we want to root ourselves in the very message that Romans presents to us. And the message that Romans presents to us is one where, as Paul begins, he wants us to start here in chapter 12, verse 1. We're stepping in 12 chapters into his discussion. We want to start, first of all, by looking to the mercies of God. And this is Paul's appeal. You see that in verse 1. He says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God. Now, I grew up memorizing this passage from the New International Version. Therefore, in view of God's mercies, in light of God's mercies, and these mercies are expounded upon. But Paul has already expounded upon these mercies because he uses one little simple word. He uses that word, therefore. And that word, therefore, makes us look back to what has preceded, all of what has come before in chapter 12, verse 1. He says, therefore. And I want you to look back and go back to the mercies of God. And notice that it's not one mercy, but it's that there is an abundance of mercy, the mercies of God. Now, what specifically are these mercies that Paul is appealing to in light of God and how he has responded? Let's quickly trace through what has happened already in Romans, very briefly. In chapters 1, 2, and 3, Paul has presented the human problem. The problem being that all people are born into this state of sin, that they have rebelled against God, that they have not regarded his ways, and in fact, they don't even care. And some just don't care. This is religious activity. Let people do what they want to do. So what? There is a total disregard of anything for the things of God. Just doesn't matter. I'll live a moral life. I'll try and do my best. I'll try and be a good person, but God, whatever. And Paul says in Romans 3 that there is no one who seeks God, no, not one. There is no one who turns aside from his wicked ways. That we are all alike in that we have this common problem. And the problem is that sin cuts through the heart of every single human being. That it's not a skin color problem. It's not a class problem. It's not a gender problem. It's a human problem. And so we're all united in this problem, that we're all in sin. But Paul goes on then in Romans 3:21 to the end of chapter 5 to talk about God's plan. So if humans had a problem, which is sin, this is God's plan. And God's plan was that he would send his only Son, the Son whom he loved, this triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, God the Father, sending his Son into the world, and that he might take people who in Romans 5 are described as weak, who are described as enemies, who are far from God, and he sends his Son. And when does God send his Son? Does God send his Son when humans start to get over their problem? When they're starting to get strong? When they're more friendly towards him? When they're getting their lives put together? No. Paul makes it very clear in Romans 5, verses 6 through 8, while we were still weak, while we were sinners, while we were enemies. There was no inclination from us to be strong. There was no inclination for us to be moral as according to God's standard, and there certainly wasn't any friendly attitude towards God. But God sent his Son when we were weak, immoral, and his enemies. And that's when Christ came. Christ came in that moment. He came in that moment to us, we're told. And this was God's plan, that God would send his Spirit, as Romans 5 talks about, that he would send his Spirit, and he would not just send his Spirit, but that he would also flood our hearts. When we didn't have an inclination to be spiritually interested, when we were more interested in being on our phone in this moment rather than hearing the very mercies of God, that Christ would be so gracious. And the Father and Son sending the Spirit, that the Spirit would be poured into the driest of souls. And that dry soul would be inflamed with a love, the love of God, a love that would flood that heart so that we would know that Christ walked my death, that he didn't merely leave heaven, but he also experienced the wrath and hell that I deserve, that he received what he didn't deserve. It was what I deserved. And in fact, Paul goes so far as to say that this isn't just something that was experienced in the past and that we move on, but rather that this is an ongoing, continuing experience. That when my soul was dry, he flooded my heart with love. And now the only look that my Father has towards me is one of tender mercies and love upon love upon love. And that's how he looks upon us. So the human problem was sin. God's plan was salvation through Christ. And God's promises he lays out in Romans 6 through 8. And he'll go on even in 9, 10, and 11 to talk about some of his promises. The problem that still exists in each one of us is that we have these lingering suspicions about God. That we wonder, that with our deep-seated suspicion, we know that we still disappoint, we still stumble and fall into sin, and that we're not living a life that is perfectly pleasing to God. And we can almost wonder, is God saying, how can they do that again after all I've done for them? As though he's a begrudging Father who is in heaven. But Romans talks about how God has given us his Spirit into our hearts, and that by this Spirit we call him Abba, Father, that we delight in him. And so the very heart of God, the mercies that flow to us, they come to us to deal with every single problem that we have. And in the mercies of God, Jonathan Edwards would call it that God's mercies are an ocean without shore or bottom. That's how broad, how deep, how wide, how long are his tender mercies, that east and west don't even meet in the mercies of God. There's so much mercy in Christ that it surpasses all of the sin of humanity. But because we have these lingering doubts, Paul wants to reassure us with the promises of God that if you could not do anything to earn your salvation, if he looked upon you with love when you were unlovable, if he looked upon you and chose you to call you child when you were an orphan, if you were alienated when you were alienated, that he came near to you, and that he loved you with an everlasting love. If you were so unlovable that God would choose to love you, then what do you think could do anything now to remove his tender mercies from you? Do you think you could really blow it? that big so that his mercies wouldn't cover? Paul says that he's given us his Spirit, and by that Spirit we cry, Abba, Father. And that's nothing can separate us from the love of God, neither height nor depth nor anything else in all of creation. And in light of this promise, he chose to save us and sanctify us, and he will take us all the way home. Is this not abundant mercy? This is not mercy just to make your mind think about these things. These are mercies that are intended to flood your heart, that you feel them, that you know of the tender mercy of God to you and to me. And that in light of these mercies, in view of them, as we look to them so that we have a heart that beats with this adoration, oh God, you are so good and kind. In view of God's mercies, then the second thing that we see is that we are to offer our bodies as living sacrifices. After 11 chapters of mercy upon mercy upon mercy upon mercy, we come now to our response. How should we respond? The language here is so familiar to us, to offer our bodies as living sacrifices, that we've become so accustomed to it that we very seldomly think about all of the Old Testament connections that are here. That there is this picture of a sacrifice being placed on the altar. And as the sacrifice is placed on that altar, that it would be sent up in smoke and flames and incense, that it would be a pleasing aroma, that God would smell that it would be a fragrance filling the place of sacrifice. But sacrifices in the Old Testament, although they had different applications, some for sin and guilt, some for thanksgiving and worship, here they all ended in the same way. A dead animal on an altar being offered in fire. But now, there's a different kind of sacrifice. It's a sacrifice that has this resurrection to it. Paul had already talked in Romans 6, verse 4, about our baptism, and he had said that we've died with Christ, and we were buried in the waters of baptism with him, and we were raised to new life, so we live a new life. And therefore, because we've died to an old way of life, a selfish way of life, our own preferred way of life, and we've been raised to a new life, therefore, the sacrifice that we offer to God is not a dead one. It's not an offering of giving up our lives so that we die in a literal sense, but rather that by dying to self, that dying to our desires, that we are raised to offer a living sacrifice. In fact, a sacrifice that can be offered again and again and again. Because it's not dead, it's not consumed by fire, it's not gone. It's continually offered, presenting ourselves, our own bodies, our very own beings to God, climbing up if you would imagine. Imagine that we are the ones climbing up upon that altar to offer ourselves to God, but not being consumed by fire, not being destroyed, not being taken up in smoke, but being able to offer ourselves again and again and again. And here is this act of newness of life. And this newness of life means that we can offer our bodies, ourselves, as living sacrifices in many ways, in view of God's mercy, because we see how gracious and merciful God is over and over to us. And we see this throughout the rest of this chapter. We see it in verses kind of 8, and all the way down to verse 20. Paul will talk about how those who have received the gifts of showing mercy, that they do it cheerfully. That he'll talk about the act of mercy in terms of verse 9, being a person who loves genuinely. Or we'll see in verse 13 that you can be a person of mercy by contributing to the needs of saints. Or verse 14, blessing those who persecute you is an act of mercy over and over when someone speaks harshly and you respond gently. That there is, in verse 15, the person who weeps with those who weeps. There is an association in verse 16 of those who are low, who are disregarded, who are forgotten by society. There is, in verse 17, a call to not repay evil with evil. In verse 19, never to avenge yourselves. In verse 20, Paul will say, but if your enemy is thirsty or hungry, give them a drink, give them something to eat. This is the living sacrifice. This is what a life of mercy looks like. It's associating with those who have been disadvantaged. Because we recognize that those who have been mistreated, who have been treated poorly, who have been neglected, who have been forgotten, who have been disadvantaged because of various reasons, that our association with them, our contributing to their needs, our love for them, even when they revile, even when they persecute, even when they lash back, is an act that demonstrates that our lives are living sacrifices. Now, that's not going to look the same for you or for me, for each one of us. It's going to look quite different. And Paul makes that very clear, that we all have received mercy as Christians. And because we've received mercy as Christians, that does not mean that its application is going to look uniform. Look at verse 6. Just consider what Paul says there. He says, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. And so that means that as believers in Jesus Christ, some of us are going to be prone to use the mercy that we have received in the public square to advocate for those who are disadvantaged, while others are going to seek to defend the rights of the freedom of worship, the freedom of free speech, for example. And they'll risk their reputations. Others will risk their health and be merciful to those who are in need of health care, who put themselves on the front lines day after day because God has shown them mercy, and they want to show that mercy to a sick person who needs the touch when they cannot have the touch of a loved one nearby. It will be the heart of a person who sees how a disadvantaged individual has been mistreated. And maybe it's contributing to their needs, or possibly it's advocating for those who have no advocate for them. These are all different ways that we are going to apply the mercy of God, but it will look different according to the gifts given to us. Some of us are going to respond to the government with thanks for protecting and rejoicing that there has been a thoughtfulness both economically and a thoughtfulness in terms of protecting the health of individuals, while others are going to respond to the government with a call to look at facts in a different light and to protect the rights of others and to protect religious freedom and freedom of speech. And there's going to be these polarizing things that we're going to feel. Others are going to rush into situations where they feel that they want to risk themselves, while others are going to be more cautious. And we can be tempted then to judge one another and forget that there's often the mercy of God behind this. Or there are some who are going to feel that a more passive approach is better when responding to racial issues or health issues, and others who are going to feel like we need to respond more aggressively. These are all things that could potentially pull us apart. And we haven't even gotten back together yet. And when we gather back together, we're going to have the kinds of conversations that does not allow us to be tempted to forget that in our diversity of responses, that we all have been rooted in the mercy of God. So Romans pulls us together when we're tempted to be pulled apart. Because we're rooted in the mercy of God. Because God's been so kind. He's been so lavish. This present age is a lot like a centrifuge that spins around. You put the test tubes in and they get spun around, and as they get spun around, there's this force, this centrifugal force that pushes everything outward. And the present age very much feels like we're being spun really hard and really fast outwardly, and that the pressure is going to drive us apart. And as wedges and cracks and fissures and divisions happen in our culture, there is also, at the same time as there is a centrifugal force that's pushing us outward, there's a centripetal force that keeps us. And that centripetal force that keeps us together is the very mercy of God. So let's come back. When we gather together, whether it's in homes at first or in multi-services later on, would you prayerfully consider how you might offer yourself as a living sacrifice? How you might look and see that your brother or sister's approach is in light of the mercy of God, and that we resist the temptation to judge one another, and instead look for mercies in each other and see that we are offering ourselves as living sacrifices, climbing back up on that altar, giving of ourselves again, so that we would be holy, a holy aroma, a pleasing aroma to God, which is our worship. So church, we can do this. And we can do this not because we're good enough and smart enough and strong enough. Good enough. And God is all-wise. And God is strong. And He will pull us and hold us together.